morning, everyone. Morning. Or is it afternoon? I'm still confused. I come from a different time zone. It's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. So all protocols observed. I'm speaking to you on the topic sustainable development in developing markets. And you know, Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. So I have 10 minutes to unpack a very loaded topic. I've chosen to frame my approach to this topic within the wider context of the relationship between economic growth and sustainable development. So what I attempt to do in this presentation is to explore the challenges and threats to the growth narrative required to drive sustainable development. But of course, I will temper that with the strengths, opportunities to sustain growth and to ensure it translates into sustainable and inclusive development. Now, in order to set the context, I wanted to situate Africa and the Caribbean in a shifting world economy, which has seen dynamic growth being exhibited by developing countries compared to developed countries, and you're seeing a figure obtained from the UNCTAD World Development Report. Now, UNCTAD describes the rise of the Global South, which commenced since early 2000s. And that growth was supported largely by a commodity boom and increased growth in demand from China in particular. During that era, we saw reference to Africa rising, lions on the move, to describe growth in African countries. The countries in the Caribbean, while we did not have such flowery language, we also experienced moderate growth, notwithstanding diverging performances between the services-based economies in the OECS sub-region and commodity-based nations such as Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. Unfortunately, however, once the commodity boom ended, vulnerabilities became very clear. A slow growth slowdown took place, consequent, of course, to compounding crises, debt, climate, conflicts, COVID-19, and a slew of other exogenous shocks. So it would appear that the Africa Rising narrative was short-lived. But growth continues nonetheless. In 2005, growth is predicted to be favorable, and within each region, there's at least one economy that is growing at an accelerated pace. Within Africa, I could point to Rwanda, which has demonstrated growth at about 8.4% between 2002 and 2004. And then in Guyana, in the Caribbean, Guyana's had 43.6% growth in 2024 and is now regarded as one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Now, the regions have experienced strong growth, I've established that. But in the midst of that growth, they have faced critical challenges that have prevented them from really translating growth into sustainable and inclusive development. And there's a lot that could be said about this, but I don't really have the time to do so. So I want to identify some factors that I think are very important, that stands out for me as a development economist. And the first I want to speak to is our trade performance, looking particularly at the composition and nature of our export commodities. Now, this is a narrative you're well familiar with, right? The fact that our regions continue to rely on the extraction and exportation of primary products. And I'm showing you Guyana on the graph, and you can see very low and declining exportation of high manufacturing and sophisticated products. Now, of course, we know the dependency school of thought, we know the ideologies of world prohibition, we know that consistent exportation of primary-based products will continue to expose us to vulnerabilities in the world market due to upswings and downswings in terms of trade. The second factor I wish to point to is the persistence of income inequality. So we've had growth, and we're having growth now, but there are still concerns about the extent to which that growth is going to be shared equally. Inequality remains a very significant structural barrier to sustainable development across all developing regions. As you're seeing in the graph before you, the top 1% earns just under 20% of the region's income in Africa. In Latin America, it's above 20%. In fact, Latin America is regarded as the most unequal developing region in the world. In the Caribbean, we have class-based and spatial inequality, which has persisted. And there's also concern about ethnic-based income gaps, particularly in countries such as Guyana. And of course, now that we have real wealth, this is a real concern that we have to deal with. So both regions have been victims of actions by others that have caused significant impacts for us. So another major concern is our limited resilience. For instance, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had estimated that the 2008 financial crisis would have resulted in losses of US $578 billion in export earnings for African countries, which was about 18.4% of their GDP. And we continue to face exogenous shocks. Energy price volatilities, and we can see from the table our dependence in our export basket on energy for those countries that are energy producers. And then there are geopolitical tensions, such as the current debacle between the US and Venezuela in the Caribbean region has reinforced. And we continue to confront environmental vulnerabilities, flooding, hurricanes. For instance, in Jamaica, there is now a US $9.5 billion financing gap to deal with the after effects of Hurricane Melissa. And of course, this graph just shows the extent to which we are affected by exogenous shocks that we have no control over. Now, I wanted to quickly give you a snapshot of how we're progressing with respect to the 2030 agenda. And we can see, I don't have the time to go through all of the variables there. We've made progress when we look at the table in quite a few areas, but it's uneven and it's incomplete. And I was quite alarmed to actually see the SDG 2 ending hunger. It appears as if Africa is retrogressing rather than progressing. So we've made progress in a number of areas, but there are persistent problems: informality in our labor market, disabilities, institutional weaknesses. These are some areas that remain to be addressed. Now, our economies have a lot of potential. We're not poor in resources, we're quite rich. And when we look at the global scenario, 80 to 90% of global gold reserves, could be found in the African region for chromium and platinum metals, 60% of arable land and timber. This is global reserves. So we're very rich regions. In Africa, there's land, minerals, petroleum. In the Caribbean, agriculture, tourism, forests, and oil. But we need to address our critical constraints. A very fundamental weakness remains our lack of structural transformation and minimum industrialization. And a very useful quote I wanted to share with you from the UNCTAD 2024 report. It says the 2003 to 2013 commodities boom revealed successful changes in East Asia, macroeconomic stabilization in Latin America, and a lack of structural transformation in Africa. So we had growth. What did we do with it? We certainly did not transform the fundamentals of our economies. There's also urgent need to address productive capacities. Productive capacities play a very critical role in setting in motion the long-term process of structural transformation, which is the backbone of sustainable development. And the available evidence shows that no nation has developed without fostering productive capacities and structural economic transformation. China, for instance, is predicted to continue to be at the forefront of many technologies because they've invested in research and development, in science, in technology, in engineering, and mathematics, subjects that matter to raising labor productivity. And then a very important issue, because my specialization is trade, and something that I feel very strongly about is our performance on the trade agreements. You all know the history behind some of these agreements. But what has been very alarming for me is our underperformance in utilizing agreements that have afforded us market access. So there's no challenge of access to market. Of course, there are other challenges with non-tariff barriers, etc. But the fact is, we've had predictability in accessing certain markets in the UK, in Europe, under the CARIFORM EU Economic Partnership Agreements, and other types of agreements, including the Caribbean Basin Initiative. But these agreements are essentially free tickets that we're not using effectively. Take a look at Sibera, for instance. 16% utilization rate when there's preferential coverage for about 5,000 tariff lines. And there are variations across countries and products with respect to how we're using this. Antigua, for instance, 0% utilization rate. You have Haiti, of course, on the other hand, with a 98% utilization rate. And there are gaps by products. So we're taking advantage of methanol and energy products, for Trinidad and Tobago in particular. But when we look at agriculture, mining, and other and manufacturing, which are products that will help us achieve that economic transformation, very low utilization. Now, industrialization is an old-fashioned idea, some may say, but it remains the pathway to development. And Caribbean Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis had advocated for a critical role for foreign investment. And a corollary of his economic prescription has been industrialization by invitation. That continues to be a relevant strategy. And when we look at the figure here, Africa is the light blue. We're seeing that we are lagging behind in terms of attracting foreign investment. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to exploit going forward, and I'm rushing this presentation, please forgive me. Right? And one such area I want to point to is the growth and expansion we are seeing in sustainable, in alternative forms of energy. UNCTAD predicts that demand for energy transition minerals is taking off and will likely grow significantly by 2050. And I believe this presents a massive opportunity for us to exploit alternative resources if we're able to manage them responsibly and strategically. And there are a whole host of opportunities. With respect to North-South trade, there are a lot of challenges that we continue to face. North-South trade, and let me just skip and go through there. We have seen at the turn of the 21st century a return to mercantilist ideologies, beggar thy neighbor policies adopted under the America First trade policy agenda, where essentially we faced increased unilateral tariffs. The issue of tariff escalation continues to be very significant and a very important limitation to our ability to transform our export baskets. Take a look at this graph. The more you add value to your exports, the higher the tariffs you're going to face in the markets of developed countries. If you export primary products, you're going to face 0 to very low tariffs. And that tells us that the political economy of the West, the trade policy is so designed to keep us exporting primary products. But of course, we have to find ways to break out of that. So in conclusion, sustainable prosperity demands a deliberate balance between economic expansion, social equity, and environmental stewardship. While higher and more stable growth is essential, it will not occur by chance. It requires well-calibrated, forward-looking reforms, policies that are proactive rather than reactive, which is the mode we seem to always be in, that deliberately elevate our growth trajectories. At the heart of this effort is the urgent task of repositioning our economies for structural transformation through strategic industrial policy. While this approach has returned firmly to the agenda of developed countries, it has remained frustratingly out of reach for many developing countries in Africa and the Caribbean. Foreign investment must be leveraged as a catalyst for this transformation. At the same time, long-standing macroeconomic vulnerabilities, particularly those constraining productive capacity, must be decisively addressed. Greater stability can also be achieved by strengthening predictable South-South trade relationships, and we are significantly underutilizing our intra-regional markets, less than 20% for both Africa and the Caribbean. But even as we address the challenges to higher growth trajectories, we must be reminded that growth alone is not enough. Economic advancement must go hand in hand with robust social inclusion, especially within our richly diverse, multicultural societies. Equally vital is the imperative to build resilience against escalating environmental threats, including flooding and hurricanes. Thank you very much.
The message was delivered. That was a PhD in 15 minutes. Honestly, incredible. It's so good to see the data backing up everything people are saying. The graphs don't lie. So thank you so much for adding the academic rigor to this discussion.